Hello, everyone. Welcome to another edition of Building Subtext, the video series where I go over the latest and greatest developments in Subtext, the story structure app for creative geniuses. And this week I made some refinements to the premise builder, which is something that I released last week, which is something that I have been working on for about 3 years now. If you haven't seen the previous video, make sure you do so because I go into it in great detail. But this week, I just made some refinements that popped up as I was working writers through helping them figure out what their story was in subtext. And then also when I was recording the class for the writers room, some small changes that make it much easier to use. So if you come into the premise builder here, it's exactly the same way it was during the first release, where you can choose a template to start off from based on the genre. You have the four basic questions that create the premise. And then you have the actual premise here, which, if you know something like greed leads to self destruction or absolute power corrupts absolutely, that's what this is. So it's a way of thinking about the meaning of your story in a simple sentence. And by making all these different choices and different decisions, it'll change the meaning of the story, which will then change the structure. So not every structure is the same. It's actually different depending on what it is that you're trying to say. And then here you have examples of narratives with similar personalities. So we come down here, the narrative personality itself is a combination of both the four main through lines, which are the main character, objective story, relationship story, and influence character, mixed with the central concern, basically the plot elements of each through line. In this personality, the objective story is all about obtaining, the main character is focused on the future, relationship story is focused on becoming, and the influence character is focused on subconscious. It's a very typical American sort of way of looking at story. And then down here, this looks a little bit different, which I'll go over in a second. But then you have the key character element, which is what's driving the entire thing. This is as deep as it goes. And here, the typical, again, Western default is avoidance. So abandon running away from your problems, that kind of thing, and you can achieve greatness. One of the first things I did was when it came down to choosing the element, it was just an open box. It was just, choose whatever it is that you think is the element and go for it. And it occurred to me that once people were asking me, well, what are my choices, that nobody has the 25 years of experience of the dramatica theory of story that I have. And so what I thought would be great is to come in here and just list the elements. Before I had a link that went to all 64, but then that didn't make sense to me because dependent upon where you have the concern set, it really narrows down those 64 choices to just 16. And even those 16 can be limited down to pairs because they're always paired off. So here you can see conscience and temptation, they're two sides, right? Consider and reconsider almost sound exactly the same. Faith and disbelief. Those represent dynamic pairs that are featured under this sort of narrative personality. Now, I know exactly what all the different elements are, but not everybody does. And so instead of leaving it up to your imagination or for you to go through 25 years of education, I threw in these four buttons because essentially they're just four different ways, four different groups of concerns. And they're a family. So it's kind of like a set personality. Future, obtaining, becoming, and subconscious are all part of the same sort of family. They're almost exactly the same sort of thing. They have slight variances, and that's what gives the through lines their different flavor, but they have a certain character to them, right? If you come into here, well, now you'll see these are the concern elements that are focused on the past and understanding and conceptualizing and memory. Past and memory sound really, really similar. You might not be familiar with conceptualizing, but that's very close to understanding. And you'll see here films that are in this sort of arrangement, this sort of narrative personality, are very different than the ones that we just saw previous in the typical arrangement. Train wreck, cars, you have future, obtaining, becoming, and subconscious. Those are very different than the past, understanding, conceptualizing, and memory. So if you come down here, you'll see that the character elements actually changed as well, which is great. You don't have to go and fish around for whatever the right element is. You can actually come right into here. And if you know sort of the character, the overall feeling of the concerns, but you're not too sure about the elements, now you can just click here, come down here, and you'll see the entire family of choices that you have. And you can choose either one of these you present them in a dynamic pair like this because a lot of times it's kind of hard to tell which one is which. Something like aware and self-aware, those are pretty different, and actuality and perception, those are clearly very different. But something like equity and equity, is your story about being too fair, or is it about not being fair? So, not being fair is not inequity, because inequity is overly favoring something. If you're focusing on a lack of equity, then you would choose equity. So, you can see it's hard to decide between the two. And instead of going through the whole thing of choosing one and then building the story, waiting the 5 minutes for it, and then finding out, well, wait, no, that's not what my story is actually about, you can easily just flip between the two of them and see which one is the right one. So, for instance, if I was to come into here and so if I picked equity here, oh, look at that. Abandon being fair, and you can understand someone. Okay, that's a very heavy sort of situation that's going on there. But maybe I want it to be inequity. What would the difference be? Abandon being unequal with something, and you can have a sympathetic understanding. And see, that way you can kind of flip between the two because in the story, dependent upon whether or not the main character is going to go through a big 180-degree paradigm shift or if they're going to maintain the course, the key part that's tied to them is going to be this element. And actually, the pair, even though one will kind of stand out as the most important one of the premise, the pair will feature throughout the entire narrative. So you can just basically choose between one of eight. Perception to actuality was a very popular one, at least at the turn of the century, where everybody's caught up with their perception of what things are and their own kind of personal take on it. And then they get to see the reality of it. That's when everything gets revealed and all everything is answered. That's kind of like what that's about. If you want to flip between the four families, and then you can see which one you feel more attracted to, which one is actually like, oh, that's the kind of elements that I want to write about or I'm attracted to. Because authors are always attracted to one of these four. Not that you can only do one, but generally speaking, they're attracted to a certain area. So, for instance, Christopher Nolan, all his films are always this family: past, understanding, conceptualizing, and memory. Memento, Inception, The Prestige, all those are in this area. Another family here: progress, doing, being, and preconscious. I always think of those as more rambunctious and more more fun, carefree, more comedies are in this area because it's not as heavy as like the past and understanding and all this stuff. It's more kind of it's you're moving around, things are happening, progress, doing, being. Preconscious is just anxieties and impulses. It's very quick, and you'll see the elements have changed as well. A very different set, a very different family of elements. Accurate and non-accurate. Is it about being tolerant? Is it not being tolerant enough, or is it being overly non-tolerant? You can choose between each of these and see how that would play out. Abandon demanding the best from everyone is a story that would be about accurate, whereas non-accurate would be abandon working outside of acceptable tolerances. And if any of these are too wild and you're not really sure exactly what that is, you of course have the list of thousands and thousands of different illustrations, so you can find one that's closer to what it is that your story is about. And then you'll see Top Gun, Star Wars, and even Shakespeare in Love, while it's not an action adventure sort of film, is definitely playful. So I always think of this family as the playful one. The typical Western one is sci-fi, 80s, quest films. If you want to say that most hero's journey films are in this area, definitely Control and Freedom, Faith and Disbelief, Feeling and Logic, Pursuit and Avoid are definitely another pair that's used all the time. In fact, the default is avoid. Abandon avoiding getting pregnant by something, and you can trap aliens. So that's a very clear story. Am I abandoning running away from something, or am I abandoning going after something? Abandon wanting to be sought after. So not even going after something, abandon wanting somebody to pursue you and instead avoid all that and prevent all that stuff from happening. That would be a different story. These are the typical sort of action adventure quest sort of stories. And then the last family was really popular in the last 10, 15 years, where you have the present and learning and conceiving and conscious. It's very present oriented. the information age, all those sort of things where it's all about what's happening here and now. It tends to shift. This family shifts every 20 years. So while at the turn of the century, it was something closer to past understanding, conceptualizing memory with like American Beauty and Sixth Sense and stuff of that nature. The last 28 years or so would be this present, learning, conceiving, and conscious. That's the family. And you'll get things like acceptance and non acceptance. I mean, almost everything was, well, non acceptance back in the day. Abandon being rejected by someone, and you can train something, or you can learn a song, or actually, if you saw there, learn one's true potential. That's where that family of narrative was in the last decade or so. Production, reduction, these aren't as familiar to Western audiences. Evaluation and reevaluation. Well, which one's which? Am I writing a story about judging something, or am I writing a story about constantly judging something? Well, again, you can just flip between the two. Abandon providing an analysis, and you can learn to appreciate something. Or perhaps your story is abandon re-examining your circumstances. So you can see they're a very considered, very thought-oriented, very thoughtful family of elements. And those are the two big changes that I made this week. I mean, they're very small, minor changes, but they really help when it comes to trying to figure out what it is your story about. And you can zero in precisely on the meaning of your story. And again, if you don't know the actual meaning of your story right off the bat, I mean, my company is narrative first, and that's based on all my experience working in the animation industry where nobody had any idea what their story was about until it was the last 2 months. So the whole idea of narrative first and subtext is to save yourself a lot of time so that you can figure out what it is that your story is about ahead of time so you don't end up making it harder for yourself down the road. So hopefully these new changes will help you out. Again, if you have any questions about how to actually develop your story or how to very quickly get to the essence of what it is that your story is about, feel free to contact me and I would love to help you out. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.